welcome to this very, very special Libsyn live stream. My name is Brian Coddington. I am so happy to be here today. Let's see, who do we got? Who do we got in the chat here? Let's see who we got here. We've got, Keith. Keith, you're here. Cool. Who else we got there? We've got Ann from Tink. Awesome. We're going to be having a fun time today. I am so excited today because this special live stream is all going to be about growing your show, but not necessarily in the way you might think about. We're talking about doing something that's a little bit different. We're not talking about monetizing your show or doing like that. No. We're talking about how you can be a podcast guest, how you can get guests, and how that can actually grow your show. We've got some fantastic representatives here from Tink Media here, and I'm so excited to talk about it because this is something that I've done for my own podcast. I've worked with Tink on their really cool Airtable to actually connect with podcasts. So I'm so excited to share this all with you. But like with every live stream, we've got some housekeeping that we got to get to. So first of all, if you haven't done so already, okay, go ahead and subscribe to the Libsyn YouTube channel. There's a little button right there down somewhere if you're watching us here on YouTube. Go ahead and hit that. That does a lot for us. Helps in the algorithm. You know, and the algorithm's important on YouTube. Outside of that, we've got some events coming up in the month of October, not just this. On October 30th at 2 p.m., myself and Corey from the Libsyn team are going to be talking about how to edit your podcast using Descript. Oh, this is going to be fun, okay? We've talked about using Premiere Pro. We've talked about CapCut. This time around, we're going to be talking about using Descript. Now, how do you know when that link is going to go up? By subscribing to the Libsyn Luma page, okay? Go to the Luma page on Libsyn. There should be a link that pops up there. And you can subscribe to us. You'll be the first to know when that live is available for you to register. Okay, now, I know there's going to be a lot of questions. Okay, there's going to be a lot of questions. This topic of how to get guests, how to be a guest is a very deep topic, and I know a lot of people are going to have questions, but you got to help me out here. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. In the chat, put a Q followed by a colon with your question. That is going to help me and the folks here in the background of the Libsyn channel to be able to organize these questions and be able to get you the questions there. I want to make sure that everyone's questions are answered, and that is going to help me tremendously. With that said, allow me to introduce our very special guest today. We have with us today Will Williams, who is a podcast critic, producer, and creator and marketing specialist with Tink Media, and Devin Andrade. Did I pronounce that right?
Pretty close.
Yeah. A digital content producer with Tink Media. Welcome to the special live stream, folks.
So happy to be here.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
Awesome. So I guess my first question for you all is, for those of you who don't know what Tink Media is, who is Tink Media?
Tink Media is a podcast growth and discovery company. Everybody at Tink, we work in marketing specifically, but we don't typically come from marketing. We come from an audio background. So for instance, I've been in the audio industry since about 2016. I was formerly a critic in the space. So I was giving reviews and writing up lists for sites like Polygon and what have you. And now we are here helping connect some of our favorite shows to some of our other favorite shows. What's nice about marketing in podcasting, as we'll talk about soon, is that it's more like making friends than it is traditional marketing. Devin, anything else to add to that?
I feel like at Tink, our thing is like, we hope people almost don't realize how much fun podcast marketing is, because then they'll all want to come do it with us. Like, we have so much fun being creative in marketing. It's not like other marketing, we're different. And at Tink, we get to have a lot of fun with that. It's collaborative. And like Will said, we are podcast fans first who came to marketing so that we could support all the podcasts. And this is such a collaborative space. So I hope if you aren't already taking advantage of how collaborative everybody in podcasting is, we inspire you to do that today.
I love that. I love that so much. And of course, we got to ask the question, why are we doing this? And what better way to ask the question than with a giant slide that says, why are we doing this? So, Will, I'll take it. You take it away from here. Why are we doing this today? What's important about podcast guesting and all that fun stuff?
Yes, podcast guesting is, in my view, one of the most underrated aspects of marketing your podcast. First off, it's really fun. Second off, it gets you into a new audience. It can seem like a lot of work up front, but the payoff is huge and you're making lasting relationships. So we're going to talk a bit about being a guest and also booking guests. Both of these things are ways to market your podcast. It feels like it's just great content. It's also marketing. That's what's nice about marketing and podcasting. Everything can kind of be both if you're doing it right.
Awesome. It's also good for like just creating relationships, right? Like
Yes.
just creating those relationships and getting to know people outside of your sphere. I mean, I've been on guests of shows and I've had people on, and like you don't necessarily think that, oh yeah, I'm creating a relationship, but you in essence have now a new outlet of people that you can reach to do that collaboration, right? So I guess my first question is just kind of something that I think just about everybody asks, and that is, in essence, how do I book a guest? You know, I think podcasters, they almost, even though like we talk on a microphone, we're not the most like extroverted people out there. Like some of us are, but I've noticed a lot of people are very like, they want to stay within their circle of friends. They don't want to reach out. They don't want to cold call people. So, you know, Will, I'll ask you first, how do I book a guest for my podcast?
You're asking the right person. I am the resident extrovert. I think the one in podcasting. I think that's me. Podcasters definitely do typically like make their art in a dark closet alone, like on purpose. I am much more of a like, get out there, make friends, connect people. So because of that, I can harness my extrovert energy for all of you. So when you're booking guests on your podcast, my first piece of advice in general, and honestly, this is kind of my advice in general, like across the board in life forever, but also in podcasting, is like, don't get in your own way. It's going to feel really scary, but it's going to be fine. You're going to be fine. So before you start thinking about how to approach a guest, make sure that you're thinking about the guests that you want to have on and why. It's really important for you to vet your guests really well before having them on. So things that I look for in potential guests when I'm booking something is somebody who, I typically like to go for people who have some podcast experience or some digital media experience, some YouTube experience, etc. I like knowing that the people know what they're getting themselves into. They have equipment that can like hold up to the test. On some of my shows, I even will specify, like, it would be great if you could have this kind of mic or something nicer, if you can be in this kind of room with this kind of treatment, if you can put up a blanket. So make sure that you're looking for guests who can give you audio that sounds good. But also make sure that they're somebody who you feel like you're gonna vibe with, you feel like you're gonna have fun with. That's one of the things about, again, this style of marketing where you're guesting and having guests on, is it should be fun. Where to start with the search process is, of course, if you're making a podcast, you better be listening to podcasts. So you should.
That's a crazy concept there, Will. I don't know if people can do that. Listen to podcasts that they potentially want to bring guests on.
The amount of times people will literally brag to me, oh, I don't listen to podcasts, I just make them. And I'm like, what? That's unhinged. Which I know is a lot coming from me, and I just made that laugh. But this would not fly in any other industry. You do not hear filmmakers saying, I don't watch movies. Everybody would rip them to shreds. So you should have a list of podcasts you love. But if you don't know where to start and you're not sure of how to find these people, we have some tools for finding shows similar to other shows. We'll get to that soon. And just make sure that you are in spaces where podcasters are. You should be doing things like joining Discord servers of podcasters. look around on social media, see who's following who, and see, again, if there are those vibe matches and if you can find people who feel like a good fit. Now let's talk about reaching out. Yes, it
This
can
is
be
a
so
scary part.
scary.
This is terrifying. I don't know. I don't know if I can do this, Will. I don't know. It's scary.
I believe in all of you so hard. I am 5'0" and I just imagine me like being a little tiny cheerleader as you write these emails. You can do this. Like, it's a hilarious visual image, and you deserve a little cheerleader. So always try to engage before you pitch. You want to have some level of familiarity there. And what's important is always, don't think of your engagement as like investing. Make your engagement actually authentic. You should be having people on your show whose work you enjoy. And if you make a podcast, you probably know that like hearing that somebody enjoys your show is way more rare than anybody would expect. We should all be saying it to each other more. And this is a great way to sort of engender some trust and some familiarity before you just cold pitch. Highly recommend engaging. Socials, if you can. If they have a newsletter, leave a comment, send a reply. It's nice and it's also helpful. And then once you pitch, which you can do, you can just send a quick email. You can just send a quick email and say, hi, this is my name. I make this podcast. I'd love to have you on to talk about this. Your first email to them can be really short and sweet. You can make it a template if you want, but make sure that you customize it and show that you know the person you're pitching to, that you know what they make, you know what they're about, and that you're making something that they would be interested in coming on. And you have to believe that you are. Don't get in your own way.
I absolutely love that. I've gotten well, it's a thing where I think podcasters sometimes want the easy route, so they make that template, right? And then they replace the thing. But it's having something that's genuine and having something that's like a person who knows who you are, has listened to your show, can even say like, hey, I loved your topic on this thing. You went really deep into this. That for me, it speaks so much, because I think, as you said, a lot of us think we're just talking into a can that goes out to nowhere, and that validation just makes us want to engage with them and want to have kind of a guest relationship. But I love that.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth pointing out, like, I have talked to, Devin and I have both talked to like some pretty big name podcasters, people that we really look up to. And straight up, they're normal people. Like, they're normal. So you don't need to feel intimidated. I know that sometimes it's going to happen, but like, it's podcasting. Like, we're not out here making gajillions unless you are a Joe Rogan. And you can be a lot more down to earth and a lot more casual than you think that you can. And also, if anyone is like dismissive or rude in a response, which I have never gotten in my like many pitch emails that I've sent, just remember that like you don't want to have them on as a guest anyway. They're rude. You dodged a bullet here. It's fine.
The only thing I could say is like it might deflate your opinion of them. Like maybe they were like the best person in your niche, right? And you go out to find them, you go out and bring them in, and then you realize, oh wow, they're kind of jerky, and you're like, oh, well that kind of is not fun there. But I mean, as you said, like, why would you want to bring someone on who doesn't have an interest in even being there, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, never meet your heroes, except for sometimes when you do, because it's really advantageous and smart. But just be aware that you might learn something about some folks. Mm-hmm. But always make sure after you send a pitch, which again can just be a short email, can be something nice and sweet. Don't worry about putting too much information up front. Make sure that you follow up. Devin, I know that we've both seen this quite a lot, especially recently, that like most of our success doesn't come from the initial pitch. It comes from following up. Yeah.
Yep. Oh yeah. Do not underestimate the follow-up. Obviously be respectful of everybody's time and try not to overdo the follow-up. Give them enough time to see the email and maybe they just forgot it, and then give them a nudge. But also use that follow-up effectively. Don't just say, hey, just wanted to make sure you saw this. Also add a little bit more in there. It's like, hey, I loved your episode this week, or I saw you talked about this week. I think it might play into what I talked about up here, kind of thing. So because we have noticed that follow-ups can make a huge difference and can be the one that you actually get the answer to, don't underestimate the quality of that.
Yeah.
Totally.
There's no fear, though. Like, I think one thing people go off with the follow-up is, like, they don't want to bug the person too much.
Okay.
Right?
Great tip.
I
just say that. Literally say that. Like,
yeah.
You can say, and we've done this in emails, because, like, we get it. We get lots of emails every day, too. If you say, like, I'm so sorry to be annoying. I just want to make sure that you saw this, loved your episode, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. Right. People like that. And I've had multiple people tell me, like, thank you so much for following up. I was sick, or this got buried in my inbox. It happens. Right. And I'm sure you can imagine if it's happening to us, it's also happening to the kind of people that you're gonna want to book as a guest too. Definitely. Inboxes get flooded. So you've landed a guest. Great job. Good job. Proud of you. Now is when you send the big email. So I'm a big fan. I have a template email that I send to my guests that explains it gives the date and the time, which I also have like a Google Calendar set up as well. I'll give the link. I use Zencastr to record, so I'll put that right in the email. I will give the segments for my podcast that they need to like be prepped, that we're going to have segments and that they should have something kind of ready. And then I also really highly encourage having a guest info packet and also a release form. I'm so sorry to be so boring and talk about legal. I am not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. So take everything I'm saying with a grain of not a lawyer salt.
It's so important though. It's so important though. And that's something that I think what you're getting at, you have to have those things because you just don't know. You don't know what that guest's reaction is going to be to the interview, to the promotion of it. They might not like the picture you chose. They might not like what they said. And it might have gotten them into hot water. You don't know that. So you have to protect. I love this though.
Yeah, and you can find like plenty of templates that exist for like a guest release form. They may or may not be like legally binding, but what I've heard from actual real lawyers is that having anything in writing is better than having nothing in writing.
Exactly.
I also think that this is really good to also protect your guest. When you make these release forms, they can be collaborative efforts. Like you can ask, what would make you feel protected here too? And then in the guest info packet, I just like collecting things like links to their website, links to their socials, handles, any important dates they have of things that they're working on, anything that will help me promote them and make sure that I've got all of their information. Obviously, like name, pronouns, email, things like that as well.
Right.
Yeah. And then for guest organization and promo tools, I really like using things like Airtable. I go pretty full force when it comes to organizing. Devin has seen the way that I harness Airtable for every single thing of my life, but at least have something like a spreadsheet where you're making sure that you're tracking all of your guests' information. You know what dates things need to go live. You have all of their handles and everything like that again. And for promo tools, I always like making sure that they have customized graphics to share, things like that. Devin, anything else to add here?
No, honestly, and I think the biggest thing is making it easy for that other person to be a guest, not leaving them with any questions. If you were to be a guest on another show, what would you want to know? What would you want to be told ahead of time in order to prepare? Always think about like, what is the other person experiencing? How can I make this easier for them? Because that also might make it easier for you. And then things will just flow more smoothly.
Exactly. It all comes down to like your goal with getting the guest is absolutely to make it as easy as possible for them to share your show, right? You want them to share the show. You want to get the most out of having that guest. You want to increase your reach, right? That's what we all podcasters want. We want more downloads. We want more reach, because that then can lead to things like sponsorship and this and that. But you have to do the work, and I love this list. Now, Devin, I'm gonna pick on you now. So, what makes a good interview? Like, what are some of the things you get the guest, you get all the packets, you get all the stuff, and then you gotta sit down and go, oh God, I now have to talk to this person that I've never met before. That now I have to do that for an hour or so and get the best bits for your podcast. So, what makes a good interview?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit of a broken record to start off, because a tip that
if it's valuable information, be broken record us all day, right?
It starts with being a good listener, but I don't mean being a good listener when you're conducting the interview. I mean being a good listener when you are listening to podcasts and when you are listening to an interview in a podcast. That, I think, is where you can learn a lot about what makes a good interview and what makes a bad interview. What do you notice when you're listening? When do you notice a guest really come alive with their answer? What really captures your attention as a listener? If you start doing that as you are listening to podcasts, it'll just feed into your interview skills. So first things first, be listening to other podcasts and paying attention to the interview style, the structure of the questions, how they flow from question to question, and always help the guest be their best selves. So thinking about that first. But then it really comes down to the research. One of my favorite things to hear when I'm listening to a podcast is when the guest says something like, oh, I can't believe you know that, or no one's asked me that question before, or no one has made that connection before. As a listener, and I would imagine as the interviewer too, like, that is such a nice experience. So if you can be doing the level of research that can get your interview to that status, then you are doing your job as an interviewer. So that can be researching where this person has written, maybe it's their own work, where they've done a written interview, especially where they've done another audio interview. So on a podcast, it could be on a show or something like that, but really finding out what they've talked about before, how that plays into what your conversation will be this time, and what you can do differently, because that's better for you and it's better for your guests. Then you're bringing just as much value, especially if it's somebody who has been on a lot of different podcasts talking about kind of a similar topic. If you can take a different approach to it because you've done the research to know how they've talked about it before, you are benefiting them, you're benefiting your listeners, and you're just increasing the status and like the quality of your show overall. So I think it's knowing.
I love that. I had an instance where that happened with my podcast, where I interviewed the daughter of George Romero, so the guy who made like Night of the Living Dead, and she was expecting me to talk about her dad and Night of the Living Dead. But I did exactly what you said. I did research. I researched her films, things that she had done. And so when I went in, I immediately was like, I'm not here to talk about your dad. I'm here to talk about you as a filmmaker. Let me tell me about how you made this project, and this project. And just as you said, Devin, she was blown away by it. Yeah. And it absolutely solidified that relationship now. So like there's truth to this.
It's such a gratifying experience, I think, for everybody involved, like for the guest, for the listener, for the interviewer. Everybody benefits from it. And there might be times where you are interviewing somebody where you also don't know the topic as well. So you might have to engage yourself with that specific topic a little bit more deeply so that you can be supportive throughout the conversation if the guest goes somewhere where you're like, oh, that wasn't necessarily mentioned somewhere else, but you know the topic well enough. So it's knowing the guest, but it's also making sure you know the topic, because again, that will help things flow and it'll help you feel confident. And listeners can tell when you feel confident and comfortable, which also kind of leads into the next part, the benefits of the pre-interview and helping make sure that guest and interviewer are confident and comfortable in the situation. That's really what a pre-interview can do. It can make sure you're on the same page about what you're going to be talking about, the style and the flow of the conversation, what the guests can expect. And then you, as the interviewer, you get a sense of how are they in a conversation? How comfortable are they on mic? And you can check technology too, so that none of that is being a barrier to the conversation. And then it gives you a chance to just break the ice.
Yep.
But I know a lot of people that do pre-interviews are very careful about the line between breaking the ice and like missing the magic that can happen between guest and interviewer when you're talking about something for the first time. So it's kind of towing that line between making sure everybody is ready and you're prepared for the conversation, they're prepared for the conversation, but the best parts of the conversation are still the ones that happen in the actual recording. So pre-interview can be like partly tech and then partly vibe check. Can I also name drop one of my favorite podcasts, Vibe Check?
I mean,
Do both of those
I love pre-interviews because, especially with someone you don't personally know, right?
Yeah.
If you don't personally know them, if you only have had email communication or DMs on Instagram or whatever, having that, you know, maybe it's 15 minutes just to kind of talk and just be like, so how was your day? How was your day? Get to know them. It makes it so that you're going to get the best stories once you're actually interviewing, because there is now that tether between you and the guest, right? That there is some relationship there already pre-established. That's not just, hey, wait 10 minutes into the interview, that's when it gets good, right? Because I've listened to podcasts where the first 10 minutes are very cold and very not really interesting, and then you get 15, 20, 30 minutes in, then it gets good because they've warmed up, right? So that's
exactly.
all
It's
Totally.
really that warm up. Will, did you want to add anything else to that pre-interview?
No, I mean, I think the other thing is like a little bit selfishly, if you do a pre-interview and you already have everything booked and you find like, oh, okay, they're a little more halting than I thought, or like the vibe isn't quite there. It also gives you like a really good idea if you're also your own editor of like, what am I going to need to look for in edits? What am I going to need to sort of like compensate for? For instance, if you have a pre-interview and somebody is cutting you off very often. Okay, so I'm going to pause more and take more space for crosstalk, things like that. I think the pre-interview gives you a really good little heads up on how to think about being a host and also looking forward to the work cut out for you as an editor.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, you can accomplish so much in just like, only has to be 15 minutes just to warm each other up a little bit. And it doesn't have to be the same day as the interview either. It can be like a week before, a few days before, whatever you're comfortable with and the other person is comfortable with. That's what your pre-interview can be. But this is the purpose that it serves and what you can get out of it. And then it goes into your prep stage. So it's you prepping the questions so that you're comfortable with the flow of the interview. And it's also how much of that are you sharing with your guest. So for prepping your questions, I think the biggest thing that you can do is know which questions or which speaking points you want to get out of the conversation. What is your goal for this conversation? What do you want the listener to walk away with? That should kind of guide how you decide what questions you're asking and even the order of when you're asking them, because you might be wanting to warm them up a little bit, then get into the real meat and potatoes. Are we still meat and potatoes of the conversation?
Yeah, we still say meat and potatoes. I still say meat and potatoes. So there you go.
Okay. I'm hungry, so that's what I'm thinking about. And then kind of easing out and making sure that there's nothing that you've missed. And your research will help structure this, but getting comfortable with what your questions are will help you be more comfortable in the interview, because I think if you've listened to enough podcasts, you've probably heard a podcast where you can tell the interviewer is just working through the questions and not engaging enough with the answer. And I think that a lot of the times that stems from them not feeling comfortable or confident in the subject matter and the conversation itself. They just want to make sure they don't mess up their question. But if you're comfortable with your research and you've prepared your questions and you know what you want to get out of it, then you'll be able to listen to what they say, maybe adjust your question slightly so that it actually addresses the answer and then lead into the next place you want to take the conversation. So that's why you need to prep the conversations or the questions for yourself and how to think about them. And then I know there's some mixed feelings about sharing questions with guests before the interview. I usually err on the side of it's okay to share them. Some people don't want to share it because they don't want the guest to come to the conversation with structured answers,
Right.
which I get. And if you get that vibe from the pre-interview, then maybe you can provide just topics so that they know. But I think you should give your guest the support so that they can be their best selves in the conversation. You shouldn't be trying to like sabotage them and hope that there's this magic that comes out of them. You should get a sense of what works best for them in the conversation and provide that support, because I think it'll give you the best conversation you can get.
Totally. I also, on that note, I always offer up the questions in advance, even if they don't ask. I think it's a really important thing for accessibility. I work with a lot of guests who are neurodivergent, who having those questions in advance, even if we don't stick to them perfectly, that just adds a lot of security, and it just feels like the kind thing to do. If you're doing hard-hitting, like capital J journalism, you know, you do you, but I think that most of us are like making podcasts about things that we like with people who we think are cool. And I don't think that we need like the rigid structure of capital J journalism, especially again, like it can just be a nice accessibility thing.
Yeah, I've had kind of hit or miss with that. I've had some people where I've sent the questions and they've been like, why did you send me questions? And I'm like, because I thought that was what you were supposed to do. But then I've also had some people who have been like, hey, thank you so much for giving me just, even as you said, you know, Will, just a rundown of what are we actually going to talk about. Because, you know, for me, I go in without anything because I'm weird and because I know the topic I'm talking about. And when you have a co-host, it's easy to do that. But when you have a guest, you have to be considerate of the fact that, hey, this is like them coming into your house and not necessarily knowing where your fridge is at and where all your stuff is at. So might as well help them out if you can.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit about being a good guest, but hopefully they've listened to your show before they come and be interviewed, because that helps them be a better guest too. But we'll get to that. But then leading into, you've had the conversation, you've done the interview, what happens afterwards? One of our favorite things to do, and maybe this could be something you discuss in your pre-interview, or maybe it comes in the follow-up email that you send, but we always ask people, how would you prefer to share this conversation, this episode? Because some people will go and they'll make like a video clip of the conversation, or they'll make a quote picture that you can post on Instagram. They'll make all of these assets, but there's only one that person is actually going to post or is actually comfortable posting. So if you have that conversation with your guest ahead of time, you can ask, how would you prefer to post this? Would you prefer an image asset? Would you prefer a video to post here? Because that might depend on where they spend their time and where they want to promote it, where they know their audience is and what their audience will be receptive to. So if you just go ahead and ask them that, it takes all the guessing game out of it for you, and you can just create the best asset for them to share, and you can make it easy for them to share. So that means including whatever the visual asset is. It means including, here's like a short snippet description, here's the longer description. When you include links for somebody to share your podcast, we always advise to not be platform specific. So don't just share an Apple link, don't just share a Spotify link, because if anybody goes and posts that and it gets in front of somebody who's like, well, I don't listen on Apple, so I guess I'm not listening to this, you just wasted an opportunity to get in front of a new listener. That breaks my heart. So we like places like Podlink or episodes.fm, where you can just make a neutral link and people can go to the platform that they prefer. So that's something also to include. And just having all of that outlined so that the person who is a guest on your show can easily share as they want to. They don't have to do a lot of the thinking of like, well, what did I even say in that conversation? I forget. Give them some quotes, give them some language to use, make it easy for them. Well, is there anything I've forgotten about that? Because that's like very marketing heavy, what I just went into.
No, it's great. I think just keeping up this idea of making it easy for your guest to be a guest and then to share your podcast. Everybody is so busy and tired all the time forever. Anything that you can take off of their shoulders is going to be meaningful to them. I think it's also worth saying, like, what we're talking about here seems like a lot of work, and it is. It can be. But I personally think that the best way to make yourself seem really professional is to trick yourself into just actually being really professional. So if you can do all this and think to yourself, like, oh, I'm making myself seem so fancy to this guest. I'm going to have this guest packet, and they don't even know that I'm some chump in my closet in the dark. That's every podcaster, and you are just being very professional, and that's going to get you some great relationships. It's going to help your marketing.
Truth to perception is reality. So
Yeah.
if you perceive yourself as the Joe Rogan, then people will see you as that. They just don't need to see that you're podcasting in your closet.
Exactly. Although I podcast in my closet all the time and I love it.
I don't anymore because
Same.
I do the video thing. So that's the thing. I have to pretty my closet up.
That's how they get you.
Yeah.
That's how they get you. And you've got one more thing, and that's editing your interview, right? That's important. Not a lot of people do that.
Yes. Yeah. I think some people will just want to take that conversation and put a intro, outro, and upload it. But again, we're kind of coming full circle to the first thing I said. Being a good listener will help you edit your interview and your overall episode. Just because you planned for the conversation and you guided the guest in all the directions you wanted to go doesn't mean that it always went in the order that is best for the listener, or maybe you went off on a tangent that isn't really relevant and is taking away from the overall message of the episode. So when you're thinking about whether you should edit your interview and how much to edit the interview, listen to it. Pay attention to moments where you might zone out or kind of lose focus. Pay attention to moments that really capture your attention and decide, do I need to trim down here? Should I rearrange this and ask this question earlier on? You have that flex. If you're thinking as an editor, as you're interviewing, you'll be able to figure out that process as you're talking, and then it'll play into your editing. So listen to the episode and think about where you could make it stronger by trimming it down. And you can tell your guests that this is just like an editorial process to make the episode as strong as possible. It's not about cutting off things that they said. It's not about not sharing their full message. It's about making sure the message is as strong as possible. You never want to change the context of what they have said. You can rearrange or you can trim, but never change the context.
This is all great stuff. This is all fantastic stuff. So just kind of moving along here. I got to ask the question here. So let's say you go through the process of getting guests, and getting guests is one thing, but I don't think podcasters quite get that there is a lot of value in, you just flip to, Will, which is being a guest on a podcast. You yourself reaching out and actually being the guest this time. I love doing that. I love being a guest on other people's shows because for me, all of the stuff that Devin just said, you don't really have to do all of that as the guest.
Yeah.
You're just kind of like, oh, I get catered this time. So, Will, take it from here. What are some of the things to keep in mind when you're going to be a guest on a show?
Yes, we get a lot of questions at Tink about, like, what is the value of being a guest? I'm not sure how that helps me and not just the podcast that I'm going to be on. But the thing about getting new listeners is, first off, you want to be exposed to a new audience, but you don't want to focus on audiences outside of podcasting. This is like one of the great myths of podcast growth, is that we need more people to be listening to podcasts. A lot of data shows, and you can find this data at Sounds Profitable, which is a great publication that does research every single year on the state of podcasting. We've kind of hit like carrying capacity for podcast listeners. And now being somebody who doesn't listen to podcasts is like an identity that people will not break. We're good on the number of like overall podcast listeners. I'll never say no to more, but I think that we're getting there. Instead, you should be looking inside the podcast sphere, people who already listen to podcasts to come listen to your podcast. So that exposure to new audiences for being on somebody's podcast, really important. The same is true for like niche growth. So one of the ways, and we'll talk about this in finding the right podcast, but say for instance, I had a fiction podcast that was largely about data privacy. And granted, it's a fiction, it's not real. I made it up. It's got magic in it. But data privacy is very real and is an important theme. So if I want people who care about data privacy to listen to my fiction show about data privacy, I'm going to go be on a nonfiction podcast that discusses data privacy and talk about data privacy. A lot of people don't think about looking into those niches and finding those audiences who have some crossover. We really like going for like vibe matches and things like that. It also, like we've talked about, it builds relationships. If you are a great guest on a podcast, first off, they're more likely to have you back. Second off, they know your name. So if you ever want to do something like a promo swap or a feed swap, do some real good collaborative marketing, you already have your foot in the door. They already have a relationship with you. It's also nice because podcasting can be lonely and it's good to have friends.
Friends are good.
Friends are good, I think,
Friends
generally speaking. So finding the right podcast, again, it's so important to stay organized. It's so important to build a list. So if you are thinking, I'm going to pitch myself as a guest to a bunch of podcasts, make sure that you're organizing it. Make sure that you have the right website, the right emails, the right host names. If you can find the producer names, if the show has a producer, that's probably who you're going to be talking to instead of the host in regards to booking most of the time. Make sure that you have all this information. Also include ideas of what you want to talk about on their show. Devin, do you have thoughts here about thinking like a producer when you pitch?
Oh, thinking like a producer. Again, I'm going to say, listen to the podcast. Because if you can prove that you understand the goals of another show, how you fit into that show and how it is produced, then when you're crafting that message to a podcast to be a guest, you can be articulating the reason why it might make sense in their editorial calendar. You're doing some of the work for the producer instead of them having to do the thinking. One of the fastest, or like one of my hacks for doing this, is I will be listening to a podcast. If I'm pitching a guest to be on that show, I'll be listening to the podcast to hear what's some of the language they use, what are some of the things they reference that I can also reference, and then that I'm also scrolling through the feed at the same time. And if they have a certain way of titling their episodes, I use that as my subject line in the email, except I, edit it to be the subject line for this guest. So you're kind of planting all of the seeds of the idea so that the producer doesn't even have to think as much when they bring this idea to the host and to the rest of the team. All of it just comes back from knowing the show.
The title and the subject matter of the email, that's really clever. Very clever.
We really like getting kind of inventive and kind of fun with emails. A while back, I worked with a podcast called This is Propaganda, which is so good. It's really tremendously edited and brilliant. And my subject lines were like, make some propaganda with these hosts. Are you making propaganda? And it was like fun and funny, and people noticed that. And then I think with cold pitching, again, this can be really scary. But what's nice about pitching yourself as a guest is you can bring so much value to a show, not just as a guest, but if you're thinking like a producer. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, when I have guests on some of my shows, I will just straight up offer, I'll feed drop an entire episode of your podcast on my feed on an off week. I'm an every other week scheduler. So on the off week, I'll drop a full episode of your podcast if you want me to, so that my audience can hear what you're like in your element and then hear what you're like in my element. And that's nice because then that's getting your audience to listen to their show. You're doing some of their marketing for them. I also, when it comes to what value do you bring, on top of your expertise, I also have a document where I put all of my Patreon bonus goods in a big like Word document with links. And I just give that to all of my guests. I just think it's really nice. I don't think that we do that enough. Like, if I'm not compensating you, like have all these fun, silly things that you wouldn't be able to otherwise have. Make sure, again, that you're personalizing everything. Like Devin said, it all comes back to knowing the podcast. And make sure that you are following up on your cold pitching just the way that you would if you're trying to bring a guest on. I don't think that we gave like times and numbers for following up. So just to put that out there, I always wait like 3 to 5 days to follow up. Business days, don't email people on the weekends.
No, don't do that.
Don't do it. Don't do it. We also don't really like Fridays. Like I would say Monday to Thursday, send your pitches. And then I don't follow up more than 3 times. But 3 is good. Feels like a lot at first. It's not. You're going to be fine.
Well, if you space it out, you know, like that, that's the key there. Is as long as you're spacing out. If you're hitting them 3 times in one day,
don't do that.
Don't do that. Please don't do that.
No, don't do that.
Email others as you wish to be emailed.
There you go.
Yes.
That's a t-shirt right there, Devin. That needs to be a t-shirt. So, with that, Devin, I'll throw this one to you. So let's say you go ahead, you get that guest spot, right? You're going to be on the podcast. How do you maximize your appearance on there? What are some things?
Okay, before we get into that, we have to just quickly talk about this.
Oh, yeah. I forgot this was going to be in here. All right, this is the coolest thing ever. It's the coolest thing ever. I didn't know anything about this until recently. I think I listened to an interview that Lauren had done on another podcast, and she had mentioned Raphonic, and I was like, I got to check this out. So this is crazy. Please talk about Raphonic and finding those shows.
Yes, Raphonic is one of Lauren's favorite tools. I never tire of hearing her introduce people to it. It's the best. But this is a way to see your podcast neighborhood. So if you were to search your podcast or a podcast that is similar to yours, if you're not getting good data for yours, this will show you where else your listeners could be and are listening. So this can be helpful for other marketing stuff. It can be helpful for finding where you could be a guest or where your guests might be. So it kind of plays into both things we've talked about. But as you can see in the image, you just get to scroll around this web. I like to pair it with like some James Bond music because I feel like I'm using some kind of like high tech.
It reminds me of, if you ever see the movie Minority Report, this thing literally has Minority Report vibes.
Yeah.
And like you'll get lost in it too. Like you'll clearly spend at least a half hour just being like, I didn't know that I was connected to this show and this show and this show. And like some that you're like, I don't even you can't even see where the crossover could be at. But then you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, I think that makes sense.
This kind of plays into something we love to say is that your audience contains multitudes, and this will demonstrate it to a certain extent and give you just a taste of all of those possibilities.
And this is a totally free tool. Like it just exists. You can just go use it. And if you are a podcaster who's not listening to other podcasts, hey, this is a great way to find some podcasts. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. So this is thinking like, is this a cold email?
Yes. This is an example that we wanted to quickly throw up for people to see how we kind of structure a pitch, especially when we're trying to think like a producer, and what language we use to just prove that we actually did listen to the show and understand how we can collaborate.
Yeah, I love that. I noticed you were doing a series called Boys in Summer. Like that right there, it shows to me the podcaster like, oh wow, they're listening. They know. Why would I not want to bring them on?
Yeah, and don't be afraid to like bold things. I know it probably seems silly, but again, we're all so tired. Mm-hmm. And we get a lot of emails. Putting a bold sentence here or there that is explicitly asking what you're asking is really important. That's the other thing. Be explicit, be direct, literally say, would you be interested in having me on as a guest? Or would you be interested in coming on as a guest? As you can see, this email is like fairly short. We've got some links to other times the person's been featured. We explain what they can talk about. But it's concise. Mm-hmm. So it can be really simple. You don't have to get super fancy.
Awesome.
Okay, and finally, you've been a guest on a show. How do you maximize that opportunity, that connection, that relationship that you've just established? The first part happens while you're actually in the interview, and that's like, how do I talk about whether it's my podcast, my book, the other work that I do? How do I incorporate that into the conversation? And I think you'll get a sense of that if the person has prepped you with a pre-interview and you know the topics. My recommendation would to be do that organically, to say things like, well, I learned this fact from this person on my podcast, to reference like examples that are meaningful and match the conversation without just talking about your podcast. But we also like to follow the rule. I think it was Tom Webster who outlined this. Again, he writes at Sounds Profitable, that if you mention the name of something 3 times, that's how many times it can take for somebody to actually like clock it, track it, keep it in their brain. So if you can organically do that throughout a conversation, then you'll have made the most of that opportunity. But a lot of good hosts will also give you the opportunity to say those things. Well, I feel like there's something you wanted to add to this.
No,
Okay.
I think it's great.
And then what can you do to make the most of the appearance leading up to it, afterwards? How do you make sure people know that you were on the show? Again, share when the episode comes out. Share that on social. If you have a newsletter, offer to feature it in your newsletter. Promote it everywhere that you can, where you know that your existing audience is. That other person, the other podcast, will really appreciate it. Instagram collabs are really great for that now too.
I love Instagram collabs. I use
Yeah, they're great.
I've been using that with just about every guest that I've brought on. My shows mostly don't talk about movies, but every once in a while we do bring on people as guest reviewers. And yeah, the power of Instagram collabs is amazing. Like, you will see your reach skyrocket just because you're tapping into their existing audience. It's really awesome.
Totally.
Yeah. We don't always know how much social media converts to downloads, but I think when you are using your own platform to reach out to your existing audience, they want to hear where you are appearing. They already care about you. So you're going to convert your existing audience, and that's what matters here. So that's why if you can do anything to promote where you know your audience is, you're helping that other podcast, and then you're just building the relationship up even more so that you can collaborate in other ways in the future, and they'll maybe promote your show a little bit more. Something else that we really love to do is if you can do some kind of feed drop with the other podcast, that is always a nice thing. Because again,
could you explain what a feed drop is to people
who
maybe don't know anything about that? Because I've heard that. I know what it is, but for other podcasters, like, what is a feed drop? Can you explain what that is?
Yes, feed drops are one of my favorite things in marketing. It's where you drop an episode of one podcast into the feed of another podcast. So it's a way for that audience to be introduced to the show via this episode that you think they'll really like. So if you have been on another podcast and your show right now is maybe taking a couple weeks off for a vacation or for the holidays or something, you could offer to drop that episode of you on another show into your own feed, because your audience is always going to be looking for more of you. So they could hear you on this other show. You're kind of doing a favor to the other show, but they had you on their show. So it's all like feeding into this relationship, and it's just good for both audiences. I think something else that can really help is just having a list of all of the places where you've been a guest. That helps with, if you're thinking about brand awareness, thought leadership. If you can point to all the places you've spoken, especially about a specific topic, that could be a good resource just for you to have, for you to share, and to help support those other shows that you are on. I know we're crunched for time, so I kind of went through that really fast.
No, I'm glad. This is so much awesome information that I really think, anyone, whatever your level of proficiency in podcasting, these skills can transcend whether you are getting 10,000 downloads or getting 550. Like this absolutely can work. And this is absolutely the thing, in my opinion, that grows a show more so than I think, paying for it. Think there's something where you have to pay for this. No, this is all done by just hard work and research. And as you said, Devin, listening. That's so important. Now, I want to make sure we get to some questions here. So we got a couple questions. If you have questions, we've got about 5 minutes left here before the top of the hour. So please put them in the chat, put a Q followed by a colon. But let's get to a couple here. We have from Jordan. He said, you mentioned earlier about joining podcast communities. Any suggestions on Discords, meetups, forums, etc.?
Yes. I'm going to throw in something that's going to sound a little bit wild. The WGA East, the Writers Guild of America East, has an audio alliance. And part of that is a Discord server, and it is spectacular. It's filled with great creators who have a lot of thoughts about podcasting, about writing, about editing. It's brilliant. Anybody can join. You do not have to be affiliated with the Writers Guild of America. You do not have to even be a writer in podcasting. You just have to be making podcasting, being in the sphere, thinking about podcasting and wanting some advice and some help. Really beautiful community. Also, obviously doing some great work out there in the industry. I have heard great things about our podcasting. I don't go to Reddit. It scares me very bad.
It's not that scary. It's not that scary. It's not that scary. Just don't. There's certain back alleys in Reddit you just don't go down. But our podcast is not that bad. I've been in there a couple times and answered questions myself, and it's honestly it's a lot of people just wanting to learn from each other.
Yeah.
And like I've even posted just be like, hey, I'm looking for guests for the next couple episodes. Is anyone interested? And I just kind of do a very cold pitch, just saying like, hey, this is the sort of thing I'm trying to talk about. Is anyone interested? And I've gotten people who've said like, yeah, I'm interested in popping on your show. So I think that there's value to it, but you just, like with everything in Reddit, you got to be careful.
Totally. I also really like following, again, podcasters on social media. Usually you'll find from them other people who are their buddies in podcasting, and you can kind of, engage, see if there's like a good friendship vibe match, It's the same as I think finding friends anywhere nowadays, which is hard. But yeah, I love all of those spaces. Oh, there's also some good Facebook groups out there, which I know it's Facebook and I don't know how populated it is right now, but shockingly, there's some really good communities on Facebook for you to check out for podcasting.
It's not a ghost town yet. It's not like that yet. Well, thank you, Johan, by the way, not Jordan. Sorry about that. So the next question I got here is from Jim, and he has, if booking guests for a third party whose podcast has yet started, what selling points would you provide to potential guests if they have no examples? Only interview friends first? That's a good question there.
So I think that we can kind of jump off of the last question and say, if you're in these groups, if you're talking to other podcasters, if you are a member of your community, because podcasting is, your friends will be people who have podcasts. They'll be people who are going to be great guests for you. So it can kind of be a 1-2 punch. Devin, any other thoughts on that too? Because I'm sure there's lots of other selling points, even if a show hasn't launched yet.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a good starting point too, because they might have a friend of a friend who could introduce you and make that connection. I think if you haven't started your show yet and you're trying to get guests, make sure that the language and information you have about the show is clear and you have a pitch deck that really helps them understand what is this show about, what's the value for me to be on this show. And it could just be the topic, the subject matter really aligns. And if you can articulate all of that as a separate PDF, don't put it all in the email and overwhelm them. But if you have that information so that they can see why it would be worth it, that will help with those pitches where it's an extra cold pitch and there's no established relationship. Having all of that information available can help. But I also think starting with your friends first can also just help you get more comfortable. So why not start with friends first? Because then you warm up, you get better. And then as you get those bigger guests, you're an expert at this now.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. I think if you don't have a show yet, honestly, just getting clear with communicating, as you said, and this is very important, the value of being on their show. It's a thing. We don't necessarily think about oh, well, I just want to be a guest because I want to be a guest. No. What are you providing value-wise for the podcaster? What do they get out of it? What's going to entice them? That's the important thing. And we kind of almost always are in self-promotion mode. So we kind of have to think like, well, what do they want? But I love that. We have another question here. This is from Christine. And this is, if you are a podcast editor and clients want you to do outreach for them, how do you ensure success with outreach?
If you are a podcast editor and clients want you to do outreach for them. That's interesting. Usually I think of this as a producer role. So First off, I would make sure that if you have any paperwork about your role, that you're not experiencing scope creep, and make sure that this is actually part of your contract with them. I hope that you have paperwork. If you don't, maybe this is a good time to talk about paperwork. Another thing about ensuring success is, I am sorry to say this, straight up, you cannot. You can't. There are a lot of times where we have incredible pitches and we really put a lot of heart and thought and time into them, and they don't land. It happens. So you're going to have a little bit of like law of large numbers here. You're going to have to be sending a lot of pitches. And then you're also going to have to be getting yourself used to the idea of rejection. Unfortunately, like, podcasting is an entertainment industry, and this is something that is simply going to happen. We really like to think about quality versus quantity. It's not about just getting as many guests as you can or getting as many guest spots and interviews as you can. It's about looking for things that are going to add a lot of value, that are really good quality for you and your audience and whoever you're working with. Focus on that. And also, if you have a client who is asking you to make promises and ensure success of anything, again, I just want you to look really closely at your paperwork.
I love
and
your
join the WGAE.
I love your honesty, Will. I really do. I love it. But yes, I'll also go with what is the scope creep here, because if you're an editor, you're not, a producer. But I get that sometimes those roles do cross over, and as you said, I hope that they have that solidified. Any other questions from our audience here? Any questions at all before we wrap up? Because we are at 3:02 here.
And I do think that Devin needs to hop, but I can stay around.
Yeah.
Yes, I do have a meeting, so I'm going to hop off. But
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. And
thank you. I think we're actually okay with questions. So I think we're going to wrap up here. If anyone has any more questions, if they want to reach out to Tink Media, what's the best way?
Tinkmedia.co, not .com, .co.
.co, not .com. I made that mistake in the pre-interview of this. But yes, go to tinkmedia.co. Join their Airtable. Like, seriously. Put your podcast out there. I did it with my show, the Cinema Psycho Show, and I did get guests from their Airtable. It does work, and it's free, right?
Yeah. Easy form to fill out. It's free. You literally say, here's what I want to talk about, or here's what I want people to talk about. I want to do these kinds of swaps. And we have had great success and gotten great stories from it. If you use our Airtable and you find success, please tell us about it. It makes us really happy. It's just really nice.
Fantastic. Well, Devin, Wilt, thank you so much. For you all, if you have not already done so, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, smash the bell. You got to smash it. And of course, hit the thumbs up to get notifications. If you like these sort of lives, do me a favor and also go to our Luma page. We've got a live coming up on October 30th. Myself and Corey from the Libsyn team, we're going to be talking about Descript and editing your podcast. And with that said, I'm Brian Coddington from Libsyn, and we will see you next time.